Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting and very thought-giving. I actually would be interested to hear you about, you have highlighted a lot of obligations that one should have when behaving as a citizen or as an office of citizenship. I was wondering how the Kenshin account or your personal account could make sense of electoral abstentionism, or like should one be entitled or obligated to take that citizenship office or act on it, or I know I do you know where I'm going?
Yeah, yeah. No, so I think I know where you're going, and so stop me if I'm going off in the wrong direction. But there's an interesting question about whether this picture actually requires that everyone vote, or whether instead it merely allows that everyone vote. And I think the picture, as I've described it so far, can be taken either way. And so let me just say a little bit on either side of that question. So mandatory voting seems like it is the way of making sure that everyone fully participates. And so in that way, looks as though it is the preferred model. But there's a question about whether you get full participation when there is, as it were, some form of penalty for failing to participate, or whether that could improperly affect it. But on the other side, there's a way in which we can, one more thing about that. We can understand the legitimacy of doing that without thinking that it's mandatory, that is the only possibility. So here's the way of thinking about the way in which the person who simply declines to exercise their right to vote, even though they have the right to vote, is nonetheless properly bound by the laws, and the laws can be thought of as self-imposed. We can treat that as the case in which having declined to do it so first of all, it can't be that that person has a complaint of the general form, I'm being made to obey decisions made by other people. Now, why does that ring hollow? I mean, obviously, people can say whatever they want, but that rings hollow, I take it, because there is a way in which, having had the chance to decide, they therefore are going along with the rest of the decision. Because they had a role to do, they didn't live up to doing their role, but they were not wronged by being excluded from the system. And so I would think that the person who doesn't bother to vote is missing an important duty of citizenship without, at the same time, necessarily standing in any other different relation to the laws than they would have had they voted. So the person who doesn't vote we might think of as like the person who votes for the unsuccessful candidate. That is, they didn't get their way, but it's part of a system. Having failed to do their part, they're still bound by the result in the same way. Is that responsive to your question?
Partly. What I had in mind is that, does your account of like ethical obligations regarding voting implies a duty to vote as such, or to take part in the system? The way I understand that on your account, the abstainers are in the same relation as the people who lose regarding the result. But you seems to imply that. Well, the question I have is, do you perceive as like a moral duty to?
Okay, all right. So that's very helpful. So I obviously didn't fully get it, but that is a slightly different question for which I have a slightly different answer. The basic thought is that there is in some sense a duty of citizenship to vote, but it may be that there is no proper enforcement mechanism for it, which is to say not that it couldn't be enforced, but that it might be improper to enforce it. Because notice there's a general feature of the office of voter, which is that it can't be that there is any oversight of how someone actually performs. The corrupt official can be removed from office, can be punished, and so on. Whereas if you vote based on your own personal financial interest or whatever, it's not just that, as it turns out, it would be too intrusive for us to intervene. It would be improper for there to be any enforcement mechanism, because then, of course, the person doing the oversight would be the one making the final decision. And then we would, as you know, Kant is always very fond of regress arguments, then there would be someone higher up who would have to oversee them. And so it has to stop somewhere, and the place where it stops is with the citizens. So there's no oversight of how you vote. And so that means there could be no oversight of whether you go into the voting booth and just decide to spoil your ballot. But that means probably there's no proper oversight of whether you show up. That doesn't mean that there's no duty of right. There's a misconception that every duty of right must be enforceable, but that couldn't possibly be true because, of course, as Kant says, the executive can't be coerced because the executive exercises the power of coercion. So too, the idea is to have everything subject to law. And what we get is the distinction between, we get conditions under which the distinction between acting within your mandate and acting outside of it has application, even though there is no further oversight of it.
You're a surgeon?
Yes, so I'm very sympathetic to the Kant, but I was kind of worried about this now. So think about a bunch of corrupt officers. We have involvement with a bunch of corrupt officers everywhere, like the judges, the police is corrupt, and so on. And I think this is going to end up undermining the rule of law and the way in which the law obligates.
Yeah.
But you might think we already live in a situation in which all citizens are corrupt. The bribing works. Like people who vote, or there's all this research on tribalism in voting and so on. So you might think, but this doesn't undermine the rule, or this seems not to undermine the rule of law. And I think this has to do something to do with the fact that those people, we can't be removed from office of voters. But I wasn't sure that that's what you want to say. So I was just
Okay, so it is true that there are many corrupt voters. Maybe you should turn off the recording for this. I'm somewhat skeptical of a lot of the political science literature on voting because it's quite it's quite similar to the political science literature on litigation, of which I'm highly skeptical. But putting that aside, there are lots of corrupt voters. And nonetheless, the system does not make sense because of it being the way in which corrupt voters get their way. It makes sense because of the way in which it allows laws to be self-imposed. So too, your example, a system in which you have lots of corrupt officials, at a certain point, you have no rule of law at all. That's true. But notice that what's wrong with there's an ambiguity in the claim that there's no rule of law if there are too many corrupt officials. One version of it is kind of empirical. And it says, and there's this huge literature on institutional corruption, which is totally fascinating and deeply disturbing. But it often doesn't say what's corrupt about corruption. And so there's this literature about how once people, it's like the literature on broken windows policing. Once corrupt officials start taking bribes, then more people will do it, as though what's wrong with it is that if someone does it, other people will do it. But that's not what's wrong with corruption. What's wrong with corruption is that it's corrupt, that you're using something public for a private purpose. So if you had a system in which every official has unfettered discretion, you wouldn't have law at all. But notice, even if you have a lot of corrupt voters, you don't have quite that. Because although they may act for improper purposes, they nonetheless act within a limited scope. Kant's criticism of Athenian democracy is both that there are no limits on the purposes for which they can act, and also there are no limits on the questions that they can answer. Corrupt voters, as you've described them, may act for improper purposes, but on a narrower range, and so it does not, it seems to me, make the entire system fall apart. The final thing I will say in response to this is famously, hypocrisy is described as the flattery that vice gives to virtue. And although there may be a lot of corrupt voting, there's a way in which no one can really admit it of themselves. And so people often accuse each other of being corrupt while maintaining the purity of their own motives. I'm not saying they're always telling the truth. I'm saying that that is the regulative principle through which everyone, even corrupt people, think of democracy as making sense.
Corey?
Thanks. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go into the theoretical philosophy stuff.
Okay.
More comfortable too. So in your presentation of the causal principle of the second analogy and your explanation of why you take it to be synthetic a priori, on the a priori bit, it sounded like you were putting a lot of emphasis on necessity and the way in which the concept of causality involves the thought of necessary connection. But I don't think that's where the a priori of that principle comes from, because there's a lot of other, or indeed of these principles comes from, because there's a lot of other concepts or categories that don't involve the thought of necessary connection that Kant thinks also figure in a priori principles. So it seems to me that the a priori in that case, the shoe is on the other foot in terms of the two criteria for a priori, namely the universality of the claim. That it's a claim about all events or all alterations, and that they have to have a cause that accounts for them. So I mean, it's true that Kant does build necessity into his concept of causality, and in this is distinct from the Humean conception. Right? He has a much stronger conception of causal connection. But I don't think the a priori hinges on that necessity.
Okay, so full disclosure that it was just meant to be an example, but so I have this whole juridical reading of the transcendental deduction that I will not burden you with right now. But the basic thought is that there is necessitation so anything that is a priori has, as you say, universality and strict necessitation. And then to show that it is a synthetic a priori principle then is to show that there is a principle that holds universally, that connects things to each other, that can govern a contingent matter. So for the dynamical categories, it's clear that there is the contingent matter of experience that is supposed to fall under them. There's an interesting story that I won't go into in any detail here, but it seems to me that if you're interested in, for example, the a priori nature of mathematics, that it too governs so when in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, I feel like I should use the blackboard and write 7 + 5 = 12 on it, but there is no chalk here. And then I could circle it and say, write on it, do not erase, so that the next class gets to see it. But the 7 + 5 = 12, it is a synthetic a priori truth with respect to all, as it were, groups of countable things. And so it too, it's strictly universal, but Alice, it's too late for me to write on the board. Yes, and everyone knows that it's universal, but it can be applied to anything, including a contingent matter. And so, but again, my interest in the political case is plainly not in the mathematical categories, but rather in the dynamical ones. And in the dynamical ones, the point that you can have necessitation with respect to a contingent matter, whatever the course of experience turns out to be, you will have determination in time. One further thing on the theoretical philosophy, it is, of course, a commonplace of, a correct commonplace of Kant interpretation, that the necessitation in the particular case follows from the necessitation in general, just as the category of existence is the course of experience, of universal experience, not of this or that particular thing. It is always within the context of a whole. So too with this case. That is, just as a contractual obligation is only binding as part of a legal order in which all contractual obligations are binding, so too, whether the shampoo caused my rash is not an isolated thing, but rather only finally determinable within a system. Coming back to the case of voting, which was my main focus, you get the exact same picture. That is, it is through the system of laws that there can be this kind of synthetic connection. You can't have isolated or singular synthetic connections. You can only have them as members of a system. Okay, and since you brought me chalk, I'll write it nice and big. Okay, and then, as promised, okay, and sometimes, oh no. So, sometimes when I teach, I try and use whatever was already on the blackboard as part of my lecture, and so I wish the next person using this classroom good luck. Okay.
Okay, so I want to ask you about how you think about discretion. So I take it we have the easy case of the wrongful exercise of discretion. So suppose a public official exercises their powers to advance some purpose that's alien to their mandate. So in the Great Canadian case, Justice Rand refers to someone, liquor commissioner, canceling someone's liquor license in their restaurant because they have orange hair, right, or for purposes of religious persecution. Or you can imagine someone giving a lecture and writing something superfluous on the board and then saying, do not erase. Anyway. This is like just to be a clear wrongful exercise of discretion. Okay, so there's that. Then we have the more complicated case, right? Where, and your example was the health officer in the case of COVID, where the mandate is, as you put it, multidimensional. So the health officer has to consider, the viability of the public health system in this emergency and, the ramifications for children and and so on. So there's multiple things that have to be considered. And what I'm interested in is, how do you think about legal standards on the exercise of discretion in the case of offices that have multiple mandates. And there's different ways to think about this. So some people are of the view, well, you simply need to further one of your mandates. Which mandate? Well, it's just up to you. You get to choose. It's sort of a very low bar. Or you could say, you have to choose, but you have to choose in light of the relevant factors. So the question in terms of whether there's a wrongful exercise of discretion will be, did you consider all of the relevant factors? If there's one you missed, then we have a wrongful exercise of discretion. Or you could say, well, you have to consider all of the relevant factors and you have to weigh them appropriately. So how do you, what's the legal standard in your view for assessing wrongdoing in the case of the exercise of discretionary power in a multi-dimensional system of mandates?
So thank you so much for that, Jacob. So one of the difficulties of writing something and then giving a talk is that you don't get to include everything you thought of. And then sometimes you get lucky and someone asks you a question where you get to just talk about the section that you left out for purposes of time. So there are two bad pictures of official discretion that I want to avoid. And they're bad pictures not because I'm going to claim that they're false, but rather because I'm going to claim that they're irrelevant. So one picture is the picture that says there's official discretion because it's really indeterminate. Or alternatively, because there's so much disagreement about it. There's this kind of Jeremy Waldron picture. Well, somebody has to decide because people don't agree, and so therefore we give someone the job of, in Waldron's Lockean vocabulary, settling it because it's controversial, or then there's a version of it that says, oh no, it's not merely controversial, it's fundamentally indeterminate. And then at the other extreme, there's the picture that you get running through Ronald Dworkin's views and running through a lot of the other kind of moral realism inflected legal philosophy that says, well, there's a correct answer, and what you're really trying to do is to discover it. So the moral realism inflected one turns it into an epistemological problem, whereas the Dworkin one turns it into, well, how else could we be arguing about these things unless we both suppose that there was a correct answer? And I want to say that's the wrong way to think about public legal institutions. Just off the top of my head, I would guess that there are some questions where there is a correct answer, and there are some questions where it's indeterminate, and there are some questions where there's just too much disagreement, and that the way in which officials should exercise discretion is the same in all of them, which is to say, they really do need to take account of all of the factors. But the exercise of discretion is what Kant characterizes as a regulative use of reason. Kant's discussion of the regulative use of reason in the dialectic of the First Critique, I think, is particularly instructive here. He tells us that in its regulative use, reason must, in investigating the world, suppose it to be as Leibniz supposed it to be, which is to say, with maximum unity and maximum variety. But of course, maximum unity and maximum variety, and if your Leibniz is God, maybe you can combine those, but no finite intellect can combine those. So what do you do when the answer is, in choosing which is the better theory, both of those pull you in different ways, and there are different ways in which you can go. And I want to say that something similar is going to apply with respect to the exercise of official discretion. And so, Jacob, you actually gave me as it were, a better behaved version of the problem than the actual problem, because you supposed that there was clarity about what all of the relevant factors are. But of course, there can be unclarity about that too. But I take it that the question of whether an official has done their job is the question, have they taken account of all of the relevant factors? And how do we figure out? And so if they have simply considered one of them, then they haven't done their job. Then they have imagined themselves either to be the fence inspector, or alternatively, they have simply taken upon themselves to choose between aspects of their mandate, and then there is a question on what grounds could they do that. Now, of course, it could turn out that all of the factors align, but the basic question, question one, did the official act for an improper purpose outside their mandate? Question two, did they properly carry out their mandate? That is, did they properly take account of multiple factors? And that is the reason that's the right question is that the question that is being asked is whether what the official did was consistent with their mandate. And that's the proper juridical question of consistency with the mandate. And again, people may disagree about what does and does not fall within the mandate. But that means that the standard can't be the correctness one, did they balance them properly? Because if that were the question, then in fact the official would have no discretion, and it would be just an epistemological exercise. Instead, the question is, were they doing their job? And there you look at the aspects of the job. And of course, mandates get developed further. The Canadian law of self-defense, that our Supreme Court is very fond of multi-factor tests, and each year there's an additional factor to be added to be considered in determining whether an official was using excessive force. And the job gets harder and harder. But the basic question is, were they acting within their mandate? And that means, were they taking account of everything they should take account of? But it can't be, did they balance it correctly? Because then it would not be oversight, it would be substitution. Does that help?
That's great. And we have Violetta and Alice.
Well, it was a pleasure to hear your talk. Thank you very much. I have a question about what it would be for a person to use their judgment responsibly when voting. So I'm thinking about, so we know that we shouldn't think about our private purposes and our private ends, but we should think of ourselves, I guess, as members of this citizen body. And so this is like a public office. I guess if I think about the medical official in the COVID situation, I know what it is to use that kind of public judgment and judge from that public office perspective versus their private purposes. But when it's me voting as a citizen but not a private individual, I find that a more difficult distinction to make. And then I guess the question would be like, what's entailed in me taking this public stance as a citizen? Like, what do I need to think about when I'm making this decision? And is it even something that I have the capacity to do? All of us, like, all Canadians or all Americans, do we even have the capacity to do the thing that we need to do to make that decision in a public way and to use our judgment responsibly?
Well, so that's an excellent question. And I'm going to give you a short answer and then a long answer. The short answer is yes. And the longer answer is going to tell you how it is that you have the capacity to do it. Because, again, what you have to do one of the features that, and this was part of what I was getting at with the example of choosing your unit head and then turning to the case of voting, part of your job as voter is to figure out what is and is not within the mandate. And so part of that means that you need to figure out, well, what kind of society are we? And what kind of society do we want to be? And what are our biggest priorities? And so I mentioned one of the pathologies is single issue voting. Thinking that you should vote for a candidate because of where they stand on reproductive choice, say, or where they stand against reproductive choice, and pay no attention to what they will do to all of the other things that plainly matter. Again, there are some people who will pick a different single issue on which to vote. But the point is, your job is not to bring about a particular result. Your job is to exercise your judgment about what the proper mandate of elected officials is in light of your understanding of it. And so that's something you can do. Now, there's certain parts of it, and this may lie partly behind your question, where you might think that most ordinary people lack the expert knowledge to be able to make various kinds of assessments. So it looks as though our next federal election will be fought in part over the status of the carbon tax. And it may be that most Canadians, it may be that some of you don't actually understand the economics of taxation and how this works. And it may be that many people don't actually understand how the carbon tax works because they don't understand what the rebate is. And so what should you do? So there's something you should do and there's something institutions should do. One thing that you should do is inform yourself about the issues. And of course, you're busy, you have a life, it's not your day job. And so you may do so imperfectly, but nonetheless, you do that seriously, you inform yourself about the issue, you inform yourself about the actual platforms of the candidates, and you make sure that you are actually competent with respect to the facts and you keep up with the news. So what does that mean for public policy? Well, it means that probably you need to have better education and make sure that people can understand both their duties as voters, but also basic facts of economics, basic facts of international relations. There was a report some years ago that apparently most Americans thought that 60% of their taxes went to foreign aid. And people are going to vote the wrong way if they think things like that. And so you need to inform yourself, and that means not informing yourself through TikTok videos. And so now, you said, can ordinary people do this? Well, they can. Is it asking more of them than is realistic? It might be, but the only alternative is to have rule that is not properly self-imposed.
I just wonder if it presupposes that there's going to be some kind of agreement or buy-in on what collective, like what the goal is or what the collective good is. Because if we have disagreements about that, I might still be responsibly using my judgment in this public way, but it would still not get it right.
Well, yeah, but so again, this comes back to my response to Jacob's question. Of course, the standard isn't correctness. The standard is properly using your judgment in doing your part within this system. And again, let's go back to the medical officer of health.
Right.
Maybe the medical officer of health made a big mistake. Maybe they made a mistake because they actually, someone in their office made a calculation error and it was all just a mistake. That's terrible, but it doesn't mean they didn't do their job. Now go to the case of you voting. maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you don't understand how the tax system, not you, but some voter doesn't understand how the tax system works, or some voter actually engages in the various mistakes of reasoning on which Danny Kahneman built his popular career. And they make all kinds of mistakes. It's possible that they're still doing their job. But again, and this is why I said in response to Jacob, there are probably some questions where there actually is a right answer. And there are other questions where maybe it's indeterminate, and there are other questions where people disagree. It turns out that if people are serious, the laws can be collectively self-imposed, even though some people get things just wrong. And some people are going to think others just got things wrong, even if it's a mere disagreement with no resolution. That's the thought.
Okay, I love your talk, Arthur. This is really wonderful. I have questions of clarification. Does it follow from your account that only in democratic societies, with your universal rights to vote, that the laws are binding?
No. So there's a distinction between the question of the bindingness of laws and the question of whether laws are properly self-imposed. This is the distinction that Sylvie drew this morning between the postulate of public right and the idea of the original contract. Laws are binding because people living under common public legal institutions is the precondition of any consistent exercise of freedom. And so we can understand through that how the laws can be binding even though they are binding in relation to a contingent matter. My question for today was how they could be self-imposed, which is something over and above the possibility of their bindingness. And so it's not that unless they are self-imposed, they're not binding. It's that there is a special kind of bindingness that comes from being self-imposed. So despotic laws are binding. One way of understanding today's topic is that how could laws be anything other than despotic? The answer is they could be non-despotic by being self-imposed. How can they be self-imposed? And you heard my answer.
But then it seems to me that it's a matter of legitimacy and not of bindingness in a case. But
yeah, so the bindingness is connected to the exercise of the democratic franchise. And so it's the output is binding either way, but it is binding for on an additional ground because self-imposed. And so you're bound by despotic laws, and then you have bound yourself with democratic laws. And so that is the sense in which the laws are given to ourselves. They're laws even if they're not self-imposed, but here's how they can be self-imposed.
so now my next question. I was a bit puzzled about your claim that the voting process, and correct me if I misunderstood, is the highest level of government. Because as you said when you were mentioning Kant's critique of Athenian democracy, it is set for the voters what they're supposed to vote on. So there is a framework that they don't decide, right? There is a whole set of procedures. So how is it the highest level of...
Because it is the oversight of everything else. Every office is overseen. It is the unoverseen overseer of all else. And so it's highest in the sense that there is no supervision of whether people act within their mandate. There's no legality without public offices, but the highest, I said above the apex, the highest level of public office, it's still a public office. And so it's still limited by a mandate. But although it is still a public office, it is highest because the question of whether the occupants of that office, the officials who are voters, are doing their job is not subject to any further oversight or appointment procedure. And so we don't choose voters by determining how good a job we think they're going to do. Why? Because the we that would be doing that would then be the highest level.
I cannot put my finger on this, but this is not how I think I would intuitively think about the highest level of government.
That's why I said above the apex. There's a way in which it's both the lowest and the highest.
Okay, gotcha. All right.
All right, I think that concludes our talk.